Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to investigate why cults matter. And the source material for this presentation is the essay Du Misel and the Structure of the State from the Metaphysics of Power, once again. Now, this isn't a particularly interesting essay. It's actually more of a review which reiterates a lot of what is established in the decline of the idea of the state. But it does contain one gem. And this is the idea that the cult is a manifestation of the principles which underpin the social organism. So the cults, which exist within a social organism, connect the principles, the cultural practices, and the people. And this presentation is a personal interpretation where we're going to take this idea for a bit of a spin. Our objectives are, firstly, to rehabilitate the concept of the cult, placing it in its proper context. Secondly, to illustrate the traditional world as an organic unity of cults. Thirdly, moving on from the source material, we will observe that the modern world is, in spite of all progressive and rationalistic self-representations, deeply cultic in nature. And finally, we will demonstrate that contemporary cults are in fact products of the modern world, not pathological rejections of it. The contemporary conception. So, rehabilitating the idea of the cult, this is an unusual undertaking in the age of democracy, equality, and the rule of law. Cults are irrational, anachronistic abominations at odds with universal human rights. We should eradicate them. So the term cult is entirely pejorative in the modern context, or at least subversive and dangerous, something that undermines the grand project of the modern world. Within cults, we see irrationality, zealotry, a dark charisma which calls to the psychologically vulnerable, who are isolated, brainwashed, and preyed upon by false prophets. This is what happens to you if you join a cult within the modern way of thinking. And it's not necessarily completely false. It has to be said at the outset. We're not going to deny the idea that modern-day cults are deeply strange things, but we are investigating this further. So what is a cult? A cult is a form of social organization which approaches the universal through the particular. This is a way of being which participates in being as a whole. It thus provides a mode through which one's innate qualities are animated. And Evola says this elsewhere. He says that when you are initiated into some kind of esoteric organization, your foundational capabilities which run in your blood have to be animated through the path of initiation and the traditional practices. So a cult is a way of achieving that. The cult emphasizes a particular aspect of reality. Members are initiated, transcending their base state. They are thus positioned within the fullness of existence, which is itself fully realized through the multitude of cults in a reciprocal arrangement. Implicit in the rehabilitation of cults is the recognition that there exists more than one way of being, and that different ways of being are appropriate for different people. So already we can see this is very much at odds with the modern conception where we want a uniform way of being for everyone. And we are realizing the unity of opposites here. We have the particular, we have the universal. These are opposed aspects of reality which are realized together in the traditional world in a conscious sense and an unconscious sense in many ways, but in this case through the cult. Differentiation, X and Y. So the X-axis is the horizontal axis, the Y-axis is the vertical axis. One can expect a high degree of horizontal symmetry between various cults of labour because they serve the same social strata. So farmers, fishermen and herdsmen, all at the peasant level of society, we can imagine that all of their cults will have a certain degree of similarity to them because they're all operating at the same level of reality on the X-axis, although perhaps the farmers and the fishermen may worship different gods and have different modes through which they realise their own cultural practices. They'll be pretty similar. But moving up the Y-axis, we'll see that cults of trade, cults of warcraft, and cults of sovereignty exist for different strata. Higher vocations demand cults of a corresponding nature. Cults of exploitation, sacrifice, and command accompany those of service and duty. So as we go up the y-axis and as we go higher up in the social organism, different capabilities are unlocked, and the cults will reflect that. They'll be different to the cults that exist for the peasants in their scope and in their purpose. In the modern world, horizontal differentiation is permitted as long as free association is not. Vertical differentiation is not permitted. There exist no superior persons with superior vocations. So we're allowed to have a certain degree of difference as long as it's all on one level. We permit the idea of superficial difference as long as there's no superiority between people and vocations, basically. And we do that by denying free association. So anyone can join any of these different cults, if you will. There's no exclusion permitted. And at the same time, we deny the idea of vertical differentiation entirely. Whereas in the traditional world, free association was permitted and vertical differentiation was also just considered a natural fact of being. The modern taboo around cults. So the modern taboo does not relate to the craziness of the cults, but rather to residues of tradition that exist within them. Much of the talk around cults is that they're crazy. This is the way they're always presented. But actually, this is a way of getting at something else, which is the residue of tradition. The first issue is vertical differentiation, which occurs within a cult in a degraded form. We have the adoption of a spontaneous hierarchical social order around a living constitution, the cult leader. The second issue is voluntary association, which ensures that cults are exclusive in nature. So they don't necessarily want to include everyone. These people will go off into the forest or whatever and do their own thing. These principles manifest in a heavily degraded form because the cults are conditioned by modernity. It is convenient for the modern state to attack the principles of tradition at their weakest. The craziness of the cults is a huge benefit in this regard. So modern day cults are crazy compared to the traditional world that's described by Evola. And it's useful for the modern state that they are this way. The organic state. In the organic state, each vocation has its own cult. As we said before, the farmers, the fishermen, the herdsmen, they will all have their own cult. The various categories of warrior will have their own cult. The various merchants, and then the sovereign cult. There will be a hierarchy of cults, an extension on the y-axis, as well as a horizontal extension of cults on the x-axis at each level. More than just a horizontal patchwork of cults, differentiation has a vertical dimension as well. The cults are stratified by caste. The path of initiation implies an internal structure to each cult. There is not simply one uniform god for everyone. The particular cults comprise the state as a whole, resolution of the particular and the universal in a living organic structure. An integrated ecosystem of vocational cults and functional divinities. And this is a direct quote from Evola. This is his refined statement on what the traditional state is like, the organic traditional state, in opposition to the modern state. And so Evola discusses the Indo-European tradition, of course. These are the greatest examples of the organic state in its fully articulated condition. Greek, Latin, Iranic, Germanic, Vedic, all with a common linguistic, cultural, and mythic origin. They present a spiritual architecture which attends the traditional social architecture, an integrated hierarchy of cults and castes. So this is what I was saying right at the beginning. The system of cults is co-manifested with the actual physical manifestation of the castes. These two things are essential and go together. And in the Indo-European tradition, we have the most comprehensive inversion. This is the modern condition. We've gone from each caste has its own story to there are no castes and everybody has the same story. And what this looks like to me is a kind of techno-primitivism. Evola describes a return to collective, pre-personal forms of life. And this occurs within the monocult of the machine. To reject techniques is often considered sort of a Luddite way of thinking. This is a regressive, backwards-looking thing to reject the technical world. But actually, these pre-personal forms of life, which are realized through mass modern techniques, are Luddite in nature, or in spirit. We're going back to the communal way of living that existed prior to any of this expansion of European modernization, and the heights of culture which were contained within it, and the heights of culture that were contained within all of these other Indo-European traditions at one time or another. The monocult, as I like to call it, this is an inversion of the organic state. It demands a singular way of being for all people. The monocult approaches the particular through the universal, so it's an inversion of the cult. The cult approaches the universal through the particular. The monocult approaches the particular through the universal. It tries to take its own way of being and impose that on the entire world. In this way, the monocult becomes a cult, the cult of the universal state. So it realizes this cultic nature, in spite of the fact that everything about modernity is attempting to eradicate cults. It becomes a cult. Individuals are separated from organic social relationships and supervised by bureaucratic institutions, state media, health and education systems, HR, etc. No deviation can be tolerated. And we see this in capitalism, we see it in communism, we see it in the managerial regime of international human rights, the idea of the nuclear family, the atomized individual. All of these are manifestations of the monocult. And it has to be said, certain exoteric interpretations of Christianity contain the seeds of this as well. If you contrast this with what Evola was discussing about the Templars and the esoteric orders which existed within Christendom, his idea of the Ghibelline princes who unified sovereignty of temporal power and spiritual power. These structures within Christianity realize the organic state in Evola's view, whereas certain concepts of Christianity are much more of the sort of monocultish way of looking at things, this idea of imposing a singular way of being on everyone, a uniform relationship with God. And the monocult is ultimately a departure from the common core of Indo-European tradition, which is the imperial cult, an integrated, almost fractal arrangement derived from the plurality of vocational cults. The traditional world. Each Indo-European civilization is an organic unity of cults. So we have this structure, this organic structure of cults, which goes together in a hierarchical fashion to form the civilization, be it Greek, Iranic, Latin, whatever. And that whole European civilization, that whole Indo-European civilizational family is an organic unity of cults as well, on another level. Each of those civilizational expressions can be seen to comprise this entire family. And then above that, in a traditional way of thinking, the world's civilizational families represent an organic unity of cults. So perhaps the Chinese family of civilizations, perhaps the Central American family of civilizations, etc., etc. All around the world, in the traditional way of seeing things, we have a plurality of unique cultural expressions, united by a common principle, the full articulation of the human being, both at the level of the individual and that of the group. The full articulation of the human being requires this hierarchical, integrated structure of capabilities, from the most basic to the highest. The same thing has to occur within the civilization as well, within the social organism. This organic structure from the lower to the higher, this hierarchical extension of cults. As above, so below. And we have an integration, therefore, of all life's aspects, light and dark, high and low. And it has to be said that the monocult does actually fit this scheme. It is a dark inversion of the organic hierarchical structure, and it thus is a necessary part of the cycle. It is inherently extreme in nature, the monocult. This is the really critical thing to realize. What we live in now is totally extreme compared to the traditional world, right? It's a total inversion. It's not normal what is happening now. It is extreme, and what was happening before is normal. This is the great challenge of traditional thinking. And we have to realise that every little subcultural eruption, so every sort of strange modern day cult that emerges within the monocult must conform to the monocult's internal logic. They are derived from the monocult. They resemble the monocult. They are not anachronistic abominations. Monocult world. Homogeneity, which is critical to the monocult, can only be realised at the lower levels of being. The fully articulated human being is thus tranquilized, corroded, and homogenized. All individuality is erased through the collapse of vertical differentiation. So a fully realized human being is an insult to the monocult. The modern world cannot sustain this. It cannot permit this to happen. For you to be fully articulated and living an organic, free life is a disaster from the perspective of the modern state, and that has to be prevented. And tranquilization, homogenization, suffocation, all of these things which we experience and struggle with today are examples of the state attempting to reduce your higher capabilities down to the base level where you can be made homogeneous and uniform. Some horizontal differentiation remains. On the x-axis, for example, your job title, your consumer choices, etc., your enjoyment of the next current thing. You're allowed to choose the precise mode of your enslavement. And we see mass coercion and propaganda. The state is a charismatic saviour, a suffocating therapeutic climate, mass psychological vulnerability, the death of autonomy. So the monocult state comes to act like a cult leader. That's what I'm saying here, basically. And the monocult is a cult, much like a contemporary cult, which comes out of it. These modern day cults, then, what do we see? As with the monocult itself, we see alienation from friends and family, alienation from organic social relations. We see brainwashing, psychotropics being used, mass coercion and propaganda. These are the sorts of things which occur within modern day cults, which are brought up as crazy and terrifying bits of propaganda from the monocult in order to trap you within its systems of thought and behaviour. But modern day cults exist within the frame of the monocult. They are reflections of it. They're not anachronistic, but profoundly modern in character. So we have the TV host talking down his auto cue. This is no different from a cult leader. They're just alternative forms of total authority. The imagery is so similar, and we think that we recognise that the modern day cult leaders are using the modes of communication that the modern day state does, but we don't see that as a critical piece of information. This is seen as subversive rather than them just following the internal logic of the cultural environment in which they occur. The elimination of modern day cults is thus impossible. They emerge from the monocult and reinforce it through their absurdity, occluding the possibilities of tradition in the process. So, the fact that the monocult has these modern day cults to grind up against reinforces it. It's able to say, look at all this crazy stuff that's happening. You have to stick within the boundaries of the state, otherwise you'll become a victim of something like this. It's able to leverage its opposition in order to reinforce it, and that opposition comes directly from the monocult. It is a product of the internal logic of the modern day state. And these modern day cults have been refined and standardized in the internet age. And I would call them influencer cults. These are passive, homogeneous cults of consumption based on volume of attention. Join as many as you want, leave when you get bored. They are all the same. Beginners obtain enough followers to hawk basic products. Intermediates sell the process of influence itself. This is called freedom. So you have these kind of entrepreneur influencers who tell you how to become an influencer and how to become completely free, but they're not free. They are trapped themselves within this process of influence. Like, you can never stop. And the masters become commercial property. You can think of them as mercantile royal jelly. From product to process to a synthesis of product and process. And they're able to regenerate the technical scheme of the monocult, these master influencers. And what these are parasocial simulations contained within the security umbrella of the state. It speaks through the influencers via algorithmic tampering. So the state's able to use the algorithm's AI to dictate who is pushed to the front of the queue in terms of influence, who is banned, etc., and thus is able to ensure that the moral and technical underpinnings of the monocult are constantly regenerated and reinforced through the influencer cults. Because an influencer who achieves escape velocity becomes a dangerous cult leader if he deviates from the mythology of the monocult. So if someone starts opposing the monocult from their position of influence, then they're going to be cut down and removed from the process, basically. The algorithms and the AI systems will be able to prevent them from spreading influence anymore. Everyone's completely trapped within this system, and we're ensured constant mediated feedback, and thus the domestication of the modern day cult within the monocult. These influencers, even the ones who seem edgy, are basically subordinated alternatives, unofficially sanctioned avatars of total state authority. So let us look back at our objectives. The idea was to rehabilitate the cult, placing it in its proper context, to illustrate the traditional world as an organic unity of cults, observe that the modern day world is, in spite of all progressive and rationalistic self-representations, deeply cultic in nature, and to demonstrate that contemporary cults are in fact products of the modern world, not pathological rejections of it. And opposing the monocult, something close to the heart of probably everyone watching this. The monocult creates psychological vulnerability by denying full articulation. Eruptions at lower levels, which are spiritual in nature, are misdiagnosed as medical conditions. The monocult imposes therapy for the damage it creates within its own cult. We have to transcend this process. So this is the classic therapeutic state model that Thomas Saz talks about. This is the classic model of that Ivan Illich talks about in Medical Nemesis. And this is ultimately the way that the monocult functions. Much like a modern-day cult leader, it brings you in, it damages you, and then it provides the solution to the damage it creates. And we want to get over that, right? We want to transcend this process. So my advice would be, don't attempt to out-monocult the monocult. It is outstanding at being the monocult. It's literally its mode of operation. And on what grounds do you propose a universal complete doctrine for the world anyway? We don't need to sit within the logic of the monocult and attempt to come up with a completely different version of it that suits our own particular prejudices. That's literally just reproducing the thing which is causing the damage to us at the moment. The traditional way is to build your own cult, to follow your inner nature, to form organic social relations, and to turn your back on the monocult in some sense, and find a way to rise above it, to rise up the y-axis rather than getting stuck in the prison that's created for you. And a note of optimism as well, something to take with you from this presentation, is that living as even a remotely articulated human being in the modern context is both a vocation and a spiritual achievement. So one should lean into this. You have found your vocation. You've achieved much already by resisting this process. Take that forward with you and build your own cult. Okay, thank you very much for watching and for listening, and I will see you in the next one.